This is Climate on the Edge, where we explore the frontier of climate interventions and dive into the bold ideas that could shape our planet's future. And I'm Susan Sue. Hey everyone, we just got back from New York Climate Week, and it was great, if a little steeped in toxic positivity, a term used by the journalist Amy Westervelt of Drilled that was so compelling that we wanted to pause on the idea of toxic positivity for just a sec. Westervelt wrote in her recap, quote, "There were the expected corporate greenwashing showcases, but even the more legit climate events left me with the same feeling I've been having at most climate conferences in the past year or two. An unsettling disconnect between people noshing on past hors d'oeuvres and sipping craft cocktails while talking about the need to stay positive, tell the positive stories, give people hope, and the reality crashing in all around us," which this week included Hurricane Helene, a deadly storm and landslides in Nepal, a climate activist being sentenced to 2 years in prison in the UK for throwing soup on a painting, and as always, more news of expanding fossil fuel development, end quote. Now, all this is the reason why Climate on the Edge exists. Not to celebrate tiny wins on the downward spiral to climate collapse, or to wring our hands about inevitable climate disaster, but to understand and be curious about what else is out there that could really bend the curve. So, with that, let's turn back to the earliest of the early, what's hanging out at the edge of climate intervention. As of this recording, it's been 3 weeks since we launched Climate on the Edge. To kick off, we talked to Nikki Batchelor, Executive Director of XPRIZE Carbon Removal, and Jack Andreessen, Carbon Removal Manager at Breakthrough Energy. I wanted to have Nikki and Jack to anchor the show because in this past year especially, carbon removal has started to feel more established. For example, the participants in the Department of Energy's direct air capture hubs are huge companies like Shell, Mitsubishi, Occidental Petroleum, Battelle, which is the 94-year-old applied science and engineering company, and well-funded startups like Climeworks and Heirloom. Nikki, who's incredibly thoughtful and was also just fresh off of a site visit, reminded us of the humbling reality that she encountered there, which is actually putting steel in the ground or moving thousands of tons of crushed rock hundreds of miles across land is really hard, and we haven't figured it out yet. Her take was that there are still lots of frontiers within carbon removal, but two major areas of work that she pointed out were around measurement reporting and verification, or MRV, which she said is still basically a series of bespoke consulting projects today for the biggest projects, and around building market demand, of course, which market demand is really just dominated by still a few big names like Microsoft and Frontier, but otherwise quite nascent and underdeveloped. Jack added a different perspective. He focused more on the upstream inputs to carbon removal as areas where he saw frontier work still happening and still very much needed. For example, he mentioned industrial heat and energy generation and storage technologies as critical inputs to direct air capture, and transportation and logistics for enhanced weathering, and said that all of these areas need lots of innovation and discovery to make them scalable and economically viable, which, quite frankly, they're not today. If you're thinking about carbon removal, where to invest, or where to build in that space, definitely check out the episode with Nikki and Jack for their ideas on the biggest and most urgent market gaps. Now, speaking of building and investing in carbon removal, we also had a chance to talk to 8 XPRIZE finalists while I was speaking at the Carbon Removal Capital Summit put on by XPRIZE in Santander. These conversations were super diverse and covered wide ground, and they were quite frankly very hopeful. We talked about burying toxic liquid waste for carbon removal and for getting rid of toxic liquid waste with our vaulted deep interview with CEO Omar Abu Sayed. We heard about what's exciting enough about building large-scale direct ocean capture to get carbon removal godfather and ex-CEO of carbon engineering, Steve Oldham, to jump back into the startup game with his company Captura. We dug into questions around the use of renewable energy certificates by direct air capture facilities with Martin Freymüller, co-founder and CEO of Octavia Carbon, who reminded us that even though direct air capture is intended to clean up emissions, the extensive use of renewable energy credits where DAC facilities aren't already on clean grids could result in generating more emissions than they're removing, or at a minimum, canceling out meaningful carbon removal. And we talked about what software has to do with crushing rocks with Jim Mann, founder and CEO of Undo Carbon, which just signed a second major agreement with Microsoft this past week to do 15,000 tons of removals on top of the 5,000 tons of removals they commissioned from Undo last year. And we talked to lots of other great founders. And actually, speaking of software, one of the coolest conversations we've had so far on the podcast was with Mark Shapiro. Mark is director of contrails at Breakthrough Energy, and he and his team partnered with American Airlines and Google to do the first ever contrails experiment on real flights, where they used software to divert the flight paths of a small number of test flights, but that were really flown by humans, to see the impact on contrails formation. We rarely hear about contrails in climate conversations because they aren't tied to emissions. Contrails generate non-CO2 warming by acting like a blanket over the planet. That blanket effect traps heat in at night when it should be radiating out to space. And conversely, during the day, contrails can be responsible for a tiny amount of cooling through their reflective qualities, which kind of gets us into lightweight solar radiation modification territory. But in reality, the cooling benefit of contrails is negligible compared to their warming effect. Worse than a 90-10 ratio, according to Mark. This was a fascinating conversation for me because of three things. First, contrails are actually responsible for a significant percentage of aviation's total warming effect, something like over 35%. And second, they're demonstrably pretty easy to avoid through small changes in flight path, mostly by slightly changing altitude to avoid icy patches of air where contrails are more likely to form. Mark's team estimated that only 5 to 10% of all flights would need any adjustments, and that the fuel cost of those adjustments would be on the order of fractions of a percent. That means that we could potentially reduce aviation's climate impact by over a third for a very low cost compared with sustainable aviation fuels or carbon removal, both of which we should also explore and possibly do, but which undoubtedly have high costs and obstacles to scalability. The third most striking thing about contrails mitigation, though, is that it happens via software, which I've mentioned a couple times. We sometimes hear software didn't get us into this problem and software isn't going to get us out of it. And that's in reference to software versus hardware-based climate technologies. This used to make a lot of sense to me, but lately I've been really impressed by some of the software-only climate interventions that are possible, like Mark's test program reducing contrails. One day, he thinks it could be just another weather factor used in existing aviation navigation. And he had some interesting thoughts as to why something so obvious hasn't been widely commercialized and deployed already. The most recent episode we did was with my friend and fellow VC, Tom Quigley. Tom and his partner, Kevin, co-founded a fund called Superorganism, and it's focused on technology for biodiversity and nature. It's actually the only biodiversity-focused VC fund out there, and it's pretty controversial. Its thesis focuses on technology empowering nature both for its own sake and also as the backbone of human thriving. Tom is an energetic optimist, which is needed when you're dealing with biodiversity in nature. So I initially emailed Tom after reading an article in the conservation and nature news site Manga Bay that absolutely destroyed me. It was about H5N1, the bird flu that's been ravaging wild and agricultural animal populations and pushing species to the brink of extinction, as if climate change, land use, and human encroachment weren't enough. Anyway, I was feeling pretty depressed and, quite frankly, alarmed after reading the article, so I reached out to the most buoyant conservation person that I know, and that's Tom. Tom and I ended up having an incredible and incredibly hopeful conversation about the overlap and non-overlap between climate and biodiversity, and why all climate people should care about biodiversity, and how to even define it and think about it, and why he thinks that it's humans, not nature, that we should be really worried about. Our conversation completely reframed the problem and the opportunity for me and made me think a lot about technology's role in not just climate, but in nature itself. Okay, to close this out, I wanted to share a couple of rapid fire need to knows that I pulled from recent headlines related to the topics we talk about here on Climate on the Edge. So here it goes. First, the country of Vietnam just launched a low emissions rice initiative that's going to give just under $40 million US in carbon credit payouts to farmers in the Mekong Delta for adopting farming practices that will reduce methane emissions from rice paddies. Now, you may or may not know this. A lot of people do. Rice farming generates a massive amount of methane, which has up to 80 times the global warming potential of CO2. And that's because farmers typically flood their paddies with water, and then organic matter sitting in that water tends to generate methane. You get low emissions rice when you use different farming methods like alternate wetting and drying, which has already been tested pretty extensively in Vietnam specifically, like aerobic rice systems where rice is grown as dry seedlings with no flooding, and by doing things like switching to lower methane rice varieties and doing precision nutrient management. Now, I remember talking to a startup last year, MIDI, that was focused on measurement reporting and verification, MRV, for rice, and I thought it seemed super niche. I am so glad that I'm proving to be wrong and that countries in the global south are increasingly playing a role in the carbon economy. In other big carbon removal news, the company Blue Sky, which does biochar based carbon removal, just entered a sales agreement to sell $105 million worth of removals at $275 a ton. This is pretty crazy because it's a large deal. It's $105 million over 10 years, but still, and helps Blue Sky to financially de risk some of the technology development that they still have to do on their pyrolysis system. And it's also just a relatively high per ton price for removals. Now, it's nowhere near the holy grail of $100 per ton that we hear a lot about. And Blue Sky is even in the relatively cost effective carbon removal category of biochar. So they've gone out and found a buyer that's willing to pay them over double, almost three times as much as the $100 per ton benchmark. And that's just incredible to me. The other thing about this deal is that the buyer is undisclosed, which is crazy. I have yet to see a multi-million dollar carbon removal deal where the buyer didn't want to get some press value and positive brand impressions as part of their purchase agreement. So I'm very surprised by this and don't quite know what to make of it. It does make me think, though, about some of the XPRIZE conversations we had for Climate on the Edge, most notably my chat with Axel Reynaud of Net Zero, who said that carbon removal needs to get more expensive, not cheaper, to drive innovation and market expansion because we need to show that massive viable businesses can be built here. Which really reminds me of the supply, not demand, drives marketplaces theory of growth. It also reminded me, of course, of my conversation with Jason Aramburu of Applied Carbon, since they also do biochar. Another major carbon news story comes to us out of China. China just expanded its ETS, its emissions trading scheme, which is already the world's biggest carbon market. And it's expanding from covering just the power sector to now also including steel, aluminum, and cement. This one change will make it so that China's carbon market, which is a compliance market, now covers 60% of all of China's total emissions. This is definitely, as a side note, one of the benefits of centralized power, the ability to decide that, hey, these sectors emit a lot and are getting in the way of our net zero goals, so let's rein them in, or at least start to. Now, on that point, though, one caveat is that China's ETS is based on carbon intensity, the emissions per unit of output, not on total emissions. So as a result, in its current form, it has a pretty limited effect on incentivizing lower carbon intensity production. And of course, all of this depends on how the government decides to set its emissions benchmarks per industry, since compliance markets usually depend on benchmarks and credits. If it's a high benchmark, then just having a lot of emissions under the jurisdiction of the carbon market doesn't necessarily result in actually reducing those emissions since the benchmark is high. Still, this is a fascinating development because we know that steel, aluminum, and cement are hard to abate industries. And in many cases, for example, in the US, they've kind of gotten a pass because of how critical they are to building infrastructure, including climate infrastructure. But in China, they're being recognized as emitters and gathered under the wings of the compliance market. In the relatively near future, China watchers expect that oil refining, chemical, paper, aviation, other building materials, and non ferrous metals industries will all eventually get added to the ETS, covering up to around 75% of China's total emissions. Even though there are many, many imperfections and loopholes still to be worked out, this is as close to a price on carbon as we've seen anywhere in the world. And a price on carbon is invariably the number one answer that anyone and everyone I have ever talked to within the world of carbon removal points to as the lever that would change everything. So it'll be very fascinating to see how this develops. In a final headline showcasing how climate is truly on the edge these days, the southwestern city of Chongqing, which happens to be where most of my Chinese family still lives, and which has been experiencing yet another punishing heat wave since late July, which, yes, that means about 2 months now. Chongqing authorities recently experimented with cloud seeding for rainfall stimulation to get some temporary relief from the heat on the streets. So it did rain, but this particular cloud seeding had some unintended consequences. It also caused a windstorm, a massive windstorm that sent people's underwear flying. And consequently, now it's becoming called the underwear storm. Now, how did this happen? Well, in Chongqing, as in many places around the world, laundry is customarily hung out to dry on high rise balconies. Cloud seeding, or cloud seeding specifically for rainfall, that is, can alter local weather patterns because it changes the distribution and movement of air masses. So that means when rain does start coming down, the air right underneath the cloud cools rapidly. Cooler air is denser and heavier, so it rushes downward, displacing the warmer air that's there at the land surface. This whole process can create huge gusts of wind that become especially pronounced in areas with lots of tall buildings, which is a lot of Chinese cities. And then also specifically in places with steep hills and valleys like Chongqing. This is the latest in the somewhat negative press that cloud seeding has gotten lately. Between flash floods in the UAE that were incorrectly blamed on cloud seeding, it turned out not to be due to cloud seeding, according to atmospheric scientists who've studied the case, to last year's efforts in Thailand to combat toxic air pollution and drought. But it's important to remember here that cloud seeding isn't a monolith. It's actually a few different practices, the most developed of which are focused on rainfall, and the most frontier of which are focused on brightening clouds to increase their solar reflectivity. Both types carry opportunities for resilience and adaptation, as well as outright and immediate heat reduction, but also risks. Everything from your underwear flying around your neighborhood to floods and hailstorms to the many unknowns surrounding increasing clouds' reflectivity. All of this is why Climate on the Edge exists. In the past week, we've seen half a dozen highly sensational yet factually incomplete news stories in major publications covering frontier climate interventions. So, over the next month, we'll be going much deeper than the headlines allow by talking to the frontline researchers and practitioners in these fields. Here's a quick preview of what we have coming up. We talk to Kelly Wanser, Executive Director of Silver Lining, about what everyone's getting wrong about solar radiation modification and why we so need fundamental atmospheric science research now more than ever, and why we're so behind. We're also talking to Dr. Omar Farha of Northwestern University about metal organic frameworks and how they could help us blast through challenges around everything from energy to water. And we chat with Anna Burstein of NYU about the intersection of climate, extreme heat, and public health. As always, I and the whole Climate on the Edge team welcome your comments and feedback anywhere you feel like reaching us. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time. Thanks for listening to Climate on the Edge. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the show and consider dropping us a 5-star rating and review. You can also follow us on social media so you never miss an update. Climate on the Edge is brought to you by Emergence, innovative minds exploring climate's next frontier. Thanks again for tuning in. See you next time.